It's time for my favorite segment of this show, Money, Power, Politics. And in case you missed it, the president declared victory over the affordability crisis. Now, that might be news to the more than 60% of Americans who are very concerned about the price of health care, housing, and food. And normally, we spend a lot of time in this segment looking at all the ways Trump's policies are impacting your finances, like $5,000 Doge dividend checks, or $2,000 tariff dividend checks, or $1,000 savings checks from expiring health care subsidies. There's a pattern here. Catch on. You remember those? Okay, folks, those checks never arrived. But we know what has arrived. There's been higher health care costs, more tariffs, and a whole lot of uncertainty. David Gura joins me now. He is a correspondent from Bloomberg and the host of the podcast, The Big Take. And John Harwood, a veteran Washington correspondent, distinguished fellow at Duke University, and columnist for Zatea on Substack. David.
He has the White House. He has a compliant House of Representatives. He has a Supreme Court shaped in his image. And yet the most consequential pieces of his agenda are stalling in a chamber controlled by his own party. That is not gridlock. That is design. And the design he is colliding with is older than him, older than the modern Republican Party, older than the slogans he shouts at rallies. It is a single procedural barricade inside the United States Senate that requires 60 votes to move most legislation forward. And it is quietly blocking the acceleration of power he promised would be immediate. Pause there, because that changes the narrative. This is not a story about Democrats outmaneuvering him. It is not a story about rogue judges issuing injunctions. It is not even the deep state mythology he invokes when cornered. The force slowing him down is structural. It is institutional. It is the filibuster. And the fact that he cannot simply crush it tells you something far more significant than any executive order ever could. He ran on dominance. He promised speed. He promised retribution. He promised a border sealed, election laws rewritten, agencies purged, and opposition neutralized. He told his base that unified government would remove obstacles. But unified government without 60 Senate votes is not unified power. It is constrained power. And that constraint is infuriating him. Why does this matter? Because authoritarian instincts do not disappear when confronted with procedure. They escalate. The 60-vote threshold is not glamorous. It is not cinematic. It does not produce viral clips. But it is the difference between a simple majority imposing its will and a supermajority requirement that forces negotiation. And negotiation is oxygen to democracy, but poison to a strongman brand. He does not lack numbers in the Senate. He lacks insulation from dissent. A handful of Republicans refusing to detonate Senate rules are enough to freeze the most sweeping parts of his legislative agenda. That handful is the firewall, and the president is demanding it be removed. Consider the pressure campaign, public attacks, social media posts in all caps, direct calls to go nuclear and abolish the filibuster. This is not subtle persuasion. It is coercive politics. It is an attempt to collapse an institutional norm because it slows his timeline. And when a president tries to dismantle guardrails, not because they are unconstitutional, but because they are inconvenient, you are no longer debating efficiency. You are debating restraint. Restraint is the theme here. The Constitution fragments power intentionally. Article 1 gives Congress authority to legislate. The Senate, by its own rules, requires extended debate to be cut off by supermajority vote. That is not accidental friction. That is deliberate braking power built into the machinery of government. And braking power is precisely what he wants removed. Look at the pattern. When courts block him, he attacks the judiciary. When prosecutors investigate him, he attacks the rule of law. When bureaucrats resist unlawful directives, he promises mass firings. Now, when senators cite Senate tradition and long-term institutional stability, he demands they destroy it. The through line is not policy disagreement. It is hostility toward constraint itself. That is the escalation. In late-stage budget fights and shutdown threats, he attempted to leverage crisis to force hardline provisions through Congress. Immigration restrictions, election law changes, spending priorities engineered to reward loyalty and punish opposition. But legislation in the Senate does not move on rage. It moves on math, and the math stops at 60. He cannot reopen government with 51 votes if the minority refuses. He cannot ram through sweeping statutory change without persuading or overpowering senators who believe today's majority could be tomorrow's minority. That is not weakness in the system. That is the system working as designed, and he hates that it works. This is where it becomes more dangerous than it looks, because when leaders cannot bend institutions, they often attempt to delegitimize them. He frames the filibuster as sabotage. He portrays Republican holdouts as traitors. He suggests that rules protecting minority rights are obstacles to the will of the people, by which he means his voters. But the Senate was never designed to be a pure majoritarian instrument. It was designed to cool passions, to slow volatility, to require broader coalitions before altering federal law. Federalists 62 and 63 speak directly to this, about stability, about deliberation, about guarding against sudden impulses. That is not partisan theory. That is constitutional architecture. So when he pressures senators to discard the 60-vote rule, he is not merely advocating procedural reform. He is demanding acceleration of power with fewer institutional breaks. And once a break is removed, it rarely returns intact. Republican senators understand something he either does not understand or does not care to acknowledge: power swings. The party that eliminates minority protections when in control will one day face an opposition unrestrained by the very protections it destroyed. That is not speculation, that is history. The Senate has already narrowed the filibuster for nominations. Each erosion altered the balance of power. Each step made the next one easier. He wants the final step, now widen the frame. This is not solely about immigration bills or spending packages. It is about the governing philosophy underneath them. If the filibuster disappears, legislation requires only 51 votes. That means sweeping federal statutes could be rewritten on party line margins. Voting regulations, federal enforcement powers, agency mandates. The guardrail against abrupt ideological whiplash weakens. And when institutional friction weakens, executive ambition expands. Ask yourself why he is so animated about this particular rule. He issues executive orders freely. He dominates media cycles. He shapes judicial appointments. But executive orders can be reversed. Court rulings are unpredictable. Statutes passed by Congress are durable. They outlive administrations. They entrench policy. He does not just want temporary directives. He wants permanence. That is the inflection point. If the 60-vote threshold collapses, he could pursue legislation codifying expansive executive authority, restructuring federal agencies, tightening election oversight mechanisms in ways critics argue would suppress participation, and insulating loyalists within statutory frameworks. Each of those moves would be legal if passed through Congress. And legality is the shield that makes power harder to challenge. That is why the Senate rule matters more than the noise. Some argue the filibuster has a dark history. It was used to block civil rights legislation for decades. That is true. It has been weaponized for injustice. But reforming or abolishing it in pursuit of expanded rights is a different moral calculus than abolishing it to accelerate executive-aligned consolidation of power. Motive matters, context matters, timing matters, and the timing now is combustible. He is not negotiating incremental reform. He is demanding immediate detonation because the rule obstructs his agenda. That urgency should alarm anyone who values checks and balances, regardless of party, because once the Senate becomes a simple majority body for all legislation, the presidency aligned with that majority becomes exponentially more potent. Imagine a future where controversial federal statutes pass with razor-thin margins and no bipartisan buy-in. The legitimacy crisis would not shrink. It would explode. Every election would become an existential battle over sweeping statutory reversals. Stability would erode, and instability is fertile ground for leaders who promise order in exchange for compliance. This is where the psychological escalation becomes clear. He built his brand on winning, on never backing down, on firing those who resist. But senators are not contestants on a reality show. They have 6-year terms. They answer to statewide electorates, not to him. Some are retiring. Some represent competitive states. Some are thinking about the institution beyond his tenure. He cannot fire them. That limitation is infuriating because it reveals the boundary of his influence. He can command loyalty in the House with greater precision. The Senate is different. It was designed to be different. Longer terms, fewer members, greater insulation from immediate political pressure. That insulation is now serving as a brake, and brakes, to a leader obsessed with velocity, feel like betrayal. Notice the rhetoric. He does not frame the debate as a philosophical disagreement over Senate tradition. He frames it as weakness, as failure, as obstruction. That rhetorical shift transforms institutional defense into personal disloyalty. It narrows a structural argument into a loyalty test. Loyalty tests are corrosive inside democratic systems. When members of a party must choose between preserving institutional norms and appeasing a president's demands, the pressure itself reveals fragility. Some have resisted. They publicly state that eliminating the filibuster would haunt them when the pendulum swings. They acknowledge the cyclical nature of American politics. They are calculating long-term survival over short-term compliance. That calculation is stabilizing, for now. But the pressure will not dissipate. Each stalled bill will become another grievance. Each failure to reach 60 votes will be framed as sabotage. The narrative will intensify that unelected forces, weak allies, or outdated rules are thwarting the will of the people. And with each repetition, the legitimacy of the Senate as an independent body is chipped away. Institutional decay rarely begins with a dramatic collapse. It begins with erosion of trust. What happens if the erosion succeeds? If enough senators buckle? If the rule is abolished in a moment of partisan urgency? The immediate result would be legislative acceleration. The deeper result would be a redefinition of minority rights in Congress. The long-term result would be a recalibrated balance of power between branches. And recalibration during a presidency already testing boundaries carries risk. He has signaled repeatedly that he views executive authority expansively. He has attacked oversight mechanisms. He has characterized investigations as persecution. In that environment, reducing legislative friction does not merely streamline governance. It removes counterweight. Counterweight is what prevents collapse. Some viewers may feel reassured that the filibuster stands, for now, but do not confuse present resistance with permanent security. Political incentives shift, midterms approach, alliances fracture. External crises can be leveraged to justify procedural changes framed as emergency measures. The argument will not disappear. It will sharpen. And every time he frames the rule as illegitimate, he primes supporters to view its removal as necessary. This is bigger than one president. It is about whether institutional guardrails survive sustained pressure from within. Democracies do not always fall because tanks roll through streets. Sometimes they weaken because rules are incrementally discarded in the name of efficiency or loyalty. Efficiency is seductive, so is decisive action. But democracy is intentionally inefficient. It forces compromise. It slows passion. It protects minorities from majoritarian overreach. The filibuster, flawed as it is, embodies that friction. Remove friction and momentum surges. Momentum can be productive. It can also be destructive. Without broad consensus, sweeping statutory change becomes a pendulum weapon, wielded back and forth with each electoral swing. That volatility undermines faith in governance. And when faith erodes, citizens become more receptive to concentrated authority promising stability. That is the paradox. Right now, the Senate's 60-vote rule is an unglamorous bulwark against abrupt consolidation of legislative power aligned with an executive who has shown little tolerance for dissent. The resistance is not loud, it is procedural, it is almost boring, but its consequences are profound, because as long as 60 votes are required, he must persuade beyond his base or moderate his proposals. And persuasion beyond a base requires compromise. Compromise tempers extremity. Tempered legislation is less likely to destabilize constitutional balance. That is why this fight matters more than daily headlines. If you strip away the noise, you are left with a president pressing to eliminate a rule that slows him, and senators calculating whether preserving that rule preserves the republic's long-term equilibrium. That tension is the real battleground. Not cable news segments, not rally chants, institutional survival. The system is bending. Pressure is constant, but it has not snapped. The filibuster remains intact because enough senators, including members of his own party, recognize that today's expedient victory could become tomorrow's vulnerability. History is watching this moment quietly. Whether the rule survives will signal whether internal party resistance can withstand sustained executive pressure. If it does, it affirms that institutional loyalty can override personal loyalty. If it fails, it accelerates a shift toward majoritarian dominance in the Senate that fundamentally alters legislative power. And once altered, it will not easily revert. So when you hear arguments that this is just procedure, remember what procedure governs. Power. The power to write laws. The power to entrench authority. The power to reshape federal governance in ways that outlast any one administration. This is not about drama. It is about design. The question is whether the design holds. Stay vigilant about the quiet mechanisms, not just the loud personalities. Because the future of democratic restraint is often decided in rulebooks few people read and votes that rarely trend online. Ignore them, and you miss the warning signs. Watch them closely, and you understand where real power is either contained or unleashed.